Band is blowing Dixie, double fall time. You feel alright when you hear the music ring. Well, now you step inside, but you don't see too many faces. Coming in out of the rain, they hear the jazz go down. Competition in other places, but the horns, they blowing that sound. Way on down south, way on down south, London town.
On the 11th of April this month, Vietnam would find billionaire Truong My Lan guilty of fraud. In what's being called the most spectacular trial ever held in Vietnam, Truong My Lan was convicted of taking out the equivalent of $44 billion in loans from the Saigon Commercial Bank over a period of 11 years. Perhaps what's so unexpected about the case is that having been found guilty, Truong My Lan was sentenced to death for her crimes. The 67-year-old started her road to fortune in 1992, starting a real estate company, which slowly expanded into hospitality businesses, high-end hotels, and shopping malls. The real estate empire grew at a respectable pace up until 2018, a time when Truong My Lan had a brilliant idea. In a stroke of genius, she would order employees to set up 116 fake loan applications to Saigon Commercial Bank, with the intent of withdrawing large sums of money in order to acquire shares within the bank. After 4 years of these fake loan applications, Van Thing Phat Real Estate held somewhere between 85 to 91.5% of the bank's shares, effectively making this secret network the sole shareholder. Fast forward to October 2022, and My Lan would be arrested on charges of embezzlement, bribery, and Vietnamese banking violations. The billionaire's niece and husband would also be sentenced to 17 and 9 years respectively for their involvement. As you might imagine, for a case involving so much money, My Lan's sentencing wasn't a small affair. All up, the case involved around 200 lawyers, 10 state prosecutors, 2,700 people who were summoned to testify, and 6 tons of evidence. That's not an exaggeration either. The 101 boxes of evidence literally weighed 6 tons. Although being sentenced to death, Truong My Lan is also required to return 27 billion out of the 44 billion missing. The death sentence itself is suspected by some to be a way to pressure Truong My Lan to return some of the missing money. After all, if you're getting put to death anyway, there really isn't any incentive to return a single dime. On the other hand, the Vietnamese government doesn't gain anything for putting one of their own citizens to death. But alternatively, $44 billion is a lot of money. It's roughly enough to account for 3% of Vietnam's 2022 GDP, or enough to run the entire US military for nearly 3 weeks. Truong My Lan's sentence sets a rather interesting precedent, especially by global standards, as sentencing for white-collar crime is often much more lenient than the traditional salt-of-the-earth blue-collar crime. Cases such as Malaysia's 1MDB financial scandal or the United States' financial crisis have usually left those responsible with a comparatively light sentence. My Lan's execution has not been given a date as of time of writing. This may likely stay the case indefinitely, as Vietnam does not outwardly display its execution data to the public. We now move on to perhaps our weirdest story this month. At the start of April, former Vice President of Ecuador, Jorge Glass, was arrested by Ecuadorian police while residing within the Mexican embassy in Quito. Mr. Glass, who served as the Vice President from 2013 to 17, sought refuge in the embassy in December of last year, hot on the heels of 2 separate corruption charges, one charge relating to alleged bribes from a Brazilian construction company, and the other being a misappropriation of relief funds for a deadly earthquake in 2016. Mr. Glass fled shortly after being ordered to appear in front of a jury, but has not yet been found guilty. After all, you can't be found guilty if you never show up in court. Although Mr. Glass's guilt has not been determined in the case, he was, however, previously convicted and sentenced to 6 years in similar circumstances in 2017. In a controversial court ruling, his conviction would later be overturned in 2022. Of course, a guy being corrupt in South America isn't exactly fucking news, with the real story being that he was arrested within a Mexican Mexican embassy. For viewers who come for the fun life hacks, hiding in an embassy is an excellent way to evade authorities. Because rule number 1 of embassies is that local police can't come inside unless explicitly invited. The fact that Ecuadorian police search the place without Mexico's permission is a huge fucking deal. Rules about embassies remaining untouched even in wartime have been in place since the Romans were building aqueducts, and entering an embassy uninvited is still considered a violation of international law today. Quite famously, the creator of WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, used this little embassy trick in the UK for 5 whole years to avoid extradition to the United States. Ironically enough, Assange actually held up in the Ecuadorian embassy and was only arrested once Ecuador gave London police permission to take him away. If anything, Ecuador should know the rules better than anyone. After his arrest, Jorge Glass would be taken to a maximum security prison known as La Roca, which was modeled after Alcatraz in the United States. Unfortunately, while he was being detained, Mr. Glass would be found unresponsive in his cell. According to security staff at the prison, Mr. Glass declined to eat anything during his weekend stay in custody, and it is believed by the staff that he overdosed on sleep medication. How a guy in a maximum security prison got a hold of sleep medication, and whether this was even true, we really can't say for sure. Although Ecuador considered Glass a flight risk, Mexican authorities were still fucking furious that Ecuador would break the one rule of having an embassy. Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador would even announce that Mexico would be breaking off all diplomatic ties to Ecuador. Mexico would even send a letter to the International Court of Justice to request that Ecuador be expelled from the United Nations, arguing that they had made a clear violation of the Vienna Treaties. Although super unlikely, getting expelled from the United Nations is a pretty big deal, because you need to do some serious shit to not be a part of the club. For example, Taiwan can't join because China would go apeshit. Palestine can't join because Israel would go apeshit, and Afghanistan under the Taliban can't join, because the following groups would go apeshit. The move to grab Jorge Glass was also seen as a controversial decision within Ecuador itself, and some believe that his arrest was a political move by President Noboa to crack down on crime, following his election last year. Viewers may recall that Ecuador is the same nation which saw a TV news station taken hostage by a cartel mid-broadcast at the beginning of 2024, so Ecuador is not without its fair share of internal strife. Whether or not Jorge Glass will be found guilty once more, or whether ties between Mexico and Ecuador will be patched up anytime soon, are yet to be seen. So I guess viewers will just have to tune in next time to find out. In what marks a very special milestone, Surfshark has now sponsored us over 50 times on the channel. And much like how they help us put the news together for 5 years running, they can help you with all your VPN-related needs. In case you weren't paying attention the first 49 times, Surfshark VPN is a piece of software which allows users to appear anywhere in the world with the push of a button. This means you could be sitting in Liverpool while virtually appearing in Italy. Not only does this grant you the benefit of pretending you don't live in a place like Liverpool, but you also gain access to all region-locked content that only the silly nation of Italy could hope to provide. Along with getting to watch region-locked content, Surfshark also acts as your digital wingman when you're out browsing the web, shielding you from ads, trackers, and malware, meaning you can continue to watch videos of tall goth women in peace. Viewers can also score themselves an extra 3 months for free when they sign up with the code on screen. Alternatively, there's a QR code which makes things even easier. We even filled out the deal for you. If that's still not easy enough, we'll even send you the link on Discord. You can thank us later. The best part of all is that if you change your mind anytime in the first 30 days, Surfshark will give you a full refund for any reason in the world. You could literally tell them it was the economic forces present within the late Byzantine Empire which caused you to cancel their service, and they'll still give you your money back with a big cheesy smile. Surfshark VPN. It's cheaper than the other ones. Meanwhile, a man who left on his mobile data gets hit with a bill for $143,000. A US representative has called for the deployment of space lasers at the US-Mexico border, and Paris Olympic organizers have pre-purchased 300,000 condoms. For those wondering, that's roughly 21 per athlete. The war in Ukraine has been raging on for 26 months, or over 10 years depending on who you ask, and there appears to be no end in sight anytime soon. Separately from the war, over 100,000 people within Russia and Kazakhstan have been evacuated due to unprecedented flooding within the region of Orenburg. Unlike the previous flooding we've covered in Ukraine back in June of last year, this flooding was not the result of intentional detonation of dam architecture, but rather an overflow of mountain melt water that caused a dam collapse in the area. If it isn't Russia's bombs that blow up a dam, the next best thing is Russian incompetence. A fair number of citizens within the area voiced their frustration at the current federal government for inadequately preparing the dam for this level of water and for also providing little assistance following the flooding. Despite the Tumen region, one of Russia's largest oil-producing areas of western Siberia, declaring a state of emergency, little has been done by the federal government of Russia to assist affected locals in rescue and recovery efforts. A criminal investigation has been declared to investigate potential construction violations that may have caused the dam break, and recovery efforts are still ongoing at time of writing. In perhaps more terrifying news, a drone strike on the 7th of April landed on one of the 6 nuclear reactors within the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant located in Ukraine. Fortunately, for literally everyone on planet Earth, the nuclear reactors and accompanying technology did not experience critical damage, and there was only one casualty reported among the plant's staff. The International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, called the drone attack reckless and a major escalation of the nuclear safety and security dangers. It would also go on to say, quote, "While the damage to the nuclear plant did not compromise safety within the region, this incident has the potential to undermine the integrity of the reactor's containment system." While the 6 reactors within the plant have now been shut down for several months, the plant is still technically in operation to keep the cooling systems and other safety features maintained, making the potential for a nuclear catastrophe still a distinct possibility. While both Russia and Ukraine blame each other for the drone attack, it's clear that despite what happens, nuclear plants should always remain off-limits in a wartime situation. As good as HBO's Chernobyl was, it's in everyone's best interests that we never have cause for a sequel. The most significant development in the war over Ukraine actually happened halfway around the world, when the US House of Representatives passed a $61 billion aid package to Ukraine. The package comes after a wave of debate stretching back to 2023, with Ukraine funding becoming a more contentious issue among US lawmakers. Within the House, every single Democratic representative voted in favor of the bill, while Republicans were much more split. Generally, more traditional Republicans voted to pass the package, while those aligned with the former, and maybe also future President Donald Trump, were also against the funding. We should also probably point out that although Mr. Trump has previously stood against such aid, he was however supportive of this particular package. Those against aid packages to Ukraine have cited the US debt, which is currently sitting at nearly $35 trillion, and made the case that the money could be better spent fixing domestic issues. Supporters of the bill, however, argue that supplying Ukraine with aid is very much within the best interests of the United States. They state that a huge portion of the weapons being sent are already seen as obsolete for America's military, and sending them to Ukraine is often cheaper than getting rid of it domestically. The aid is also able to weaken one of America's biggest rivals without risking American lives, while at the same time, the aid package acts as a kind of economic boost for the US defense industry. Perhaps a more abstract benefit, however, is that world superpowers don't really get to be isolationist, as it's global influence which makes them superpowers in the first place. This is obviously a topic we've talked a lot about before, and one which will absolutely take center stage in the upcoming presidential election this year. So in the interest of time, let's get back to Ukraine. The aid comes only weeks after Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky straight up said that Ukraine would lose the war if the US cannot provide help. When we look at the situation on the ground, Zelensky certainly wasn't sugarcoating it, with Ukrainian troops having to ration shells across its entire front line. It's estimated that Russia is now firing up to 10 times the amount of artillery, and using 30 times the number of aircraft as Ukraine, which obviously leaves them heavily outgunned. As a Ukrainian soldier within the Donetsk region would put it, quote, "The Russians come at us in waves. We become exhausted. We have to leave our positions. This is repeated many times. Not having enough ammunition means we can't cover the area that is our responsibility to hold when they are assaulting us. As you might imagine, Russia was less than pleased at the announcement of the latest aid package, with the Kremlin spokesperson stating, quote, "The decision will make the United States of America richer, further ruin Ukraine and result in the deaths of even more Ukrainians. The fault of the Kiev regime." Although universally welcome within Ukraine, military experts have warned that such a delay in aid may allow Russia to strengthen its position. There is also the question of how long the aid package will take to reach Ukraine, which has previously proved to be difficult to determine. For example, Ukraine is still waiting to get promised F-16s flying in Ukrainian airspace. However, admittedly, much of this has to do with training pilots how to fly them. In a unique set of challenges, most Ukraine pilots chosen for the training have actually needed first to take classes in English before they can even start learning how to fly these things. However, when you consider that F-16s can be worth as much as $70 million a pop, it probably makes sense to make sure that pilots can read the flight manual. In any case, another $61 billion is sure to make a huge difference to those fighting within Ukraine. And although most experts suggest that it won't help Ukraine secure a victory, it's generally considered a much-needed lifeline to once again start holding their ground. The British government took its first step to phase out smoking within the country this month, with a bill that proposes to ban the sale of tobacco products to anyone born after the 1st of January 2009. Under what would be called the Tobacco and Vapes Bill, citizens turning 15 this year will never be able to purchase tobacco legally, with the aim to create a generation that never becomes addicted to smoking in the first place. The bill also aims to target youth vaping, with measures such as banning disposable vapes and restricting the flavors which can be sold. The bill currently has a fair amount of support among lawmakers, with a vote of 383 to 67 in favor of the new laws. With this in mind, there is still a fair amount of debate over whether the phase-out is a viable way to improve health outcomes, or if supporters of the law are just blowing smoke. Critics from within the Prime Minister's party have called the proposed bill unconservative, and argue that the laws will push to limit the freedom of UK citizens. Former Prime Minister Liz Truss, who famously lasted less time in office than the shelf life of a lettuce, would also call the bill, quote, "a virtue-signaling piece of legislation about protecting adults from themselves in the future." There is also the argument that there would be nothing stopping younger generations from simply asking those older than them to buy cigarettes on their behalf. History also tells us that the prohibition of such goods has previously proved ineffective, and a ban on tobacco products would inevitably lead to the formation of a black market. Supporters, on the other hand, are much more optimistic, with health experts especially praising the bill's commitment to public well-being. Authorities say that smoking causes 80,000 deaths a year within the UK, and is the #1 cause of preventable death, disability, and poor health in the nation. It should be noted that the UK isn't the first country which has attempted to phase out smoking, with New Zealand passing legislation in 2022 which pretty much did the same thing. This plan was later unceremoniously cancelled following a change of government, who cited that the revenue generated by the sale of cigarettes would be able to fund around $1 billion in tax cuts. Despite this, the axed plan was expected to save New Zealand's health system around $1.3 billion over the next 2 decades, and as many as 100,000 lives over the same time frame. Speaking to the now cancelled legislation, Senior Minister Chris Bishop would say, quote, "Our smoking rates have been declining, and we want them to continue to decline as well. We just don't think that a limited number of stores and other measures that the government has proposed are the right way to go about doing that." For transparency's sake, we should probably mention that Bishop was formerly a lobbyist for Philip Morris, the parent company of Marlboro cigarettes. Whether the UK will manage to pass a similar law is still up for debate, but its broad support among lawmakers will make it likely to eventually pass. On top of this, the opposition Labour Party seems even more supportive of the law than Rishi Sunak's Conservative Party, meaning a change in government is unlikely to derail such legislation. As it stands, however, the effectiveness of such a plan is still yet to be tested in a real-world environment. Even now, it will be many years before we know whether a phase-out of tobacco sales will be effective in improving health outcomes, or if such a strategy is doomed to go up in smoke. Tech giant Microsoft has warned that the Chinese government will attempt to use AI-generated content to influence a number of upcoming elections. The company said it expected Chinese state-backed cyber groups to target high-profile elections over the next year, including those within South Korea, India, and the United States. The Microsoft Threat Analysis Center has said that at the very minimum, China will distribute AI content through social media which benefits their own strategic positions. Discussing the effectiveness of such a campaign, Microsoft would state, quote, "While the impact of such content in swaying audiences remains low, China's increasing experimentation into augmenting memes, videos, and audio will continue, and may prove effective down the line." It is also important to know that these upcoming elections are far from the first time that the Chinese state has attempted to sway public opinion with AI-generated content, with the election in Taiwan earlier this year acting as something of a trial run. This included what appeared to be an AI-generated clip of candidate Terry Go endorsing another candidate, which was thankfully taken down by YouTube shortly after being uploaded. The now president of Taiwan was also targeted by AI content which accused him of embezzling state funds, and there was even entire generated TV news anchors who accused him of fathering illegitimate children. According to Microsoft, these anchors were created using a tool called CapCut, which is developed by the Chinese company ByteDance. If that name sounds familiar, then you might recognize it as the parent company who owns TikTok. ByteDance isn't exactly beating the "waging a disinformation war" accusations. Beijing-backed cyber group Storm 1376 have had their fingerprints in all corners of the world, with the objective to sow discourse and division. During the Hawaii wildfires in August of last year, it was Storm who started the conspiracy that the fires were deliberately ignited by a US weather weapon. It was also the same group who pushed propaganda when Japan began releasing treated radioactive wastewater into the Pacific Ocean around the same time. The Chinese government knew the process was entirely safe, but it didn't stop them from utilizing memes, AI content, and influencers to push this narrative. Microsoft also identified Chinese accounts which were impersonating US citizens, with the aim to gather data about how users reacted to certain policy positions. As Swag's qualifications are mostly Titanfall related, he decided to talk to a former cyber intelligence specialist for the Australian military for his take on this new form of information warfare. The anonymous source would comment, quote, "China wanting to influence US/other countries' elections are nothing new. They have been doing it for years. Having AI in the picture really doesn't make too much of a difference in my opinion. The US in particular have voters that will stick by their candidate no matter what is said about them. Trump voters, for example. How many individuals are actually influenced by AI-generated content? I don't know. How many would actually change their vote due to seeing this type of content? I don't know. I personally don't think enough to change the results of an election. The people that can be influenced are already being influenced. The people that can recognize this kind of thing are smart enough to know it and can acknowledge this kind of thing. It should be important to note that although the report was solely based on the actions of the Chinese government, AI content being used to influence elections is likely going to be a new problem long into the future. Of course, trying to influence elections with ultra-specific demographic targeting is nothing new, a fact that became abundantly clear after the Cambridge Analytica scandal. But different nations may even try to compete against each other in a hidden disinformation war. Back in 2020, US intelligence found that China pushed for Biden to win the American election, while Russia was running an influence campaign trying to have Trump stay in office. Looking at Trump's historic hostility towards China, as well as his current position towards the war in Ukraine, it's perhaps not so surprising that the two nations would be at odds. But it demonstrates just how complicated high-stakes elections might become in the coming years. If one thing is for certain, stories about AI being used to interfere in elections will only become more frequent as time goes on. Climate activists have won a landmark case in the European Court of Human Rights this month, arguing that climate inaction has violated the right to respect for privacy and family life. The ruling comes from a group of over 2,000 activists in Switzerland, who are mostly made up of the most formidable demographic known to man: elderly women. In a case launched 9 years ago, these women have argued that due to man-made climate change, they cannot leave their homes and suffer detrimental health effects during heat waves in Switzerland. The court found Switzerland's efforts to meet its emissions reductions targets have been woefully inadequate, which puts citizens at risk of dying when the temperature gets too high. Talking to the BBC, a member of the group, 76-year-old Kilmer Signorensen Elizabeth Stern, would comment on why they joined the movement with, quote, "Some of us are just made that way. We are not made to sit back in a rocking chair and knit. We know statistically that in 10 years, we will be gone. So whatever we do now, we are not doing for ourselves, but for the sake of our children and our children's children." She literally just said they were built different, and that they wanted to fight for a world they might never see. That might be one of the most Chad things we've ever covered. The win comes off the back of 2 other key cases which were found to be inadmissible. But as anyone who's ever worked in a cafe will tell you, elderly women know how to complain. It's therefore perhaps no surprise that they would be the ones to win the very first climate-related case in the court's history. The reason why the ruling is so significant is because not only does it affect Switzerland, but it also has legal implications for the other 45 member states. As UK-based barrister Estelle Dehon KC would explain, quote, "It comprehensively dismisses the argument that the courts cannot rule on climate legal obligations because climate change is a global phenomenon or because action by one state is just a drop in the ocean. What this means is that member states cannot shift the blame to the climate efforts of other countries if their own policies are not meeting climate targets. Not everyone has been so enthusiastic about the case, however, with Switzerland's largest party, the right-wing Swiss People's Party, calling the ruling a scandal, and has since threatened to leave the Council of Europe. However, the likelihood of this happening is very low, and Swag has personally promised to shit in his hands and clap if Switzerland actually pulls out. The court case comes right after the Earth dropped its hottest year on record, and climate scientists still warn that we are drastically off track to not beat the all-important 1.5 degree threshold. From the UN's Global Stocktake report from last year, it was stated that to even have a 50% chance of keeping global temperatures below 1.5 degrees, emissions will need to reach an all-time peak in 2025. As a reminder, we're nearly halfway through 2024 already. Despite this terrifying fact, this month's court case will likely pave the way for dozens of others throughout Europe over the next few years. We now move on to a much less controversial topic, the war between Israel and Hamas. As always, a bunch of people have died, kicking off the month with 7 aid workers from the non-profit World Central Kitchen. The workers, who were British, Australian, Polish and Irish, were killed in an Israeli airstrike south of the city of Deir el-Balah. World Central Kitchen would later state that their vehicles were clearly marked and that their location was known to Israeli authorities before the airstrikes. Following the incident, World Central Kitchen, as well as several other aid organizations, suspended their operations within Gaza, leaving 240 tons of aid undistributed within the region. The rest of the month is about what you'd expect for the most miserable place on Earth, with the discovery of a mass grave, aid being taken and sold at exorbitant prices, and Israel using AI-assisted targeting systems for their airstrikes. All man-made horrors beyond our comprehension. The biggest story of the month, however, started on the 1st of April, when a building adjacent to the Iranian embassy in Syria was struck by an Israeli airstrike, killing 16 people. Although we on the news team take the firm stance that nobody cares about Syria, the nation of Iran was fucking furious that some of its highest-ranking military personnel were killed right next to their embassy. For a bit of context, Iran and Israel have been fighting something of a shadow war all around the Middle East, a conflict which significantly escalated following the start of the current Israel-Hamas war in last October. Iran backs Hamas itself within Gaza, a group which obviously doesn't like Israel. It also backs Hezbollah, the most powerful non-state military in the world, which also doesn't really like Israel. Iran also backs militia groups within Iraq and Syria, which, as you might have guessed, really don't like Israel. Iran quite famously also backs Houthi rebels in Yemen, who are long making headlines for firing missiles at shipping vessels in the Red Sea. The Houthi rebels famously hate 2 things: cargo ships and Israel. With all of this in mind, funding, supplying, and training these groups usually leaves a thin but somewhat effective form of plausible deniability. This means that if Israel decides to airstrike one of these groups, Iran can't exactly say, "What the fuck? Those were the guys we were arming to shoot rockets at you." When Israel directly kills an Iranian general, however, that's a whole different story. On the 13th of April, Iran would launch approximately 350 projectiles at key military targets within Israel. The attack itself wasn't exactly a surprise, with US President Joe Biden giving a one-word statement to Iran hours before the attack: "Don't." US intelligence within Iran has had a pretty fucking insane track record lately, as only earlier in January, the US would warn Iran of an imminent terror attack within the nation. Quite unfortunately, the attack would ultimately go on to kill nearly 100 people. Of course, we can't give US intelligence too much credit, as if we look at the speed of Iran's Shahed drones, for example, even if they were fired from the very border of Iran, it would still take nearly 2 hours to even enter Israeli airspace. Iran would also go on to give Jordan its very own own, "You were cool to me once, so don't come to school tomorrow," telling them the day before that they should probably close their airspace until further notice. Continuing with this month, and Iran's attack on Israel could only be described as extremely ineffective. Israel, as well as the United States, United Kingdom, France, and Jordan, would intercept and destroy 99% of the fired projectiles. And the only damage done to Israel's military was minor damage at the Nevatim air base. The attack resulted in no fatalities, however 2 Israeli civilians were critically injured. Following the attack, an Iranian representative to the United Nations stated that Iran's actions were aimed at punishing Israel's crimes, and that the country, quote, "deemed the matter concluded." Although the attack was more or less a way for Iran to save face, it was however able to secure something of an economic victory. This is because while Iran spent around $100 million to launch the attack, Israel and its allies spent around $1 billion defending against it. This is enough money to fund the entire US military for just over 10 hours. Thankfully, it seems as if the attack didn't lead to further escalation within the region, with the United States telling Israel that it wouldn't support them in any offensive capacity. Iran basically said that they did what they set out to do, while Joe Biden literally told Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu to take the W. However, as a little treat, Israel would respond with a much smaller attack, launching a missile to destroy a single air defense battery within central Iran. As Israel didn't actually take credit for the missile, it's speculated that the attack was mostly symbolic, showing that they had the capacity to strike strategic points deep within Iran if they really wanted to. As far as enormous attacks between nations go, this one might have been one of the best outcomes a person could possibly hope for. With this in mind, it's perhaps insane to think that more people died on an aid mission into Gaza than from the biggest attack of its kind in world history. The news may be over, but we still have some exciting announcements. Firstly, we'd like to congratulate Jake the Analyst for getting married a few days ago. If the news seems less organized this month, then it was likely because Jake wasn't there to annoy everyone into meeting their deadlines. Good work, Jake! Our next exciting announcement involves all of you and our endless mission to make the news better. You see, we figured that as this series gets well over 100,000 views per episode, we must have viewers from pretty much all walks of life imaginable. It's probably not crazy to think that among all of us, we probably have an expert in pretty much every topic and field on Earth. This is why we're creating a database, a compilation of thousands of viewers we can call upon when current events demand closer insight. What this means is that if a fire breaks out in Italy, we can search our database for an Italian firefighter. Alternatively, if we're trying to break down a complex legal case or explain a new outbreak of disease, having a lawyer or doctor we can talk to would obviously be invaluable. It doesn't matter if you're a retail worker, pilot, game dev, or just straight up criminal. Just having people we could talk to if the need arises would make it much easier for us to provide the best news we can. For those who are interested, a link to fill out a survey for us will be down in the description. It probably goes without saying, but information can also be shared with us anonymously, and our own database won't be shared with anyone outside the team. We appreciate anyone who signs up, and we hope viewers will start to notice the difference having such a list of contacts might make. As for our other form of support, our Patreon supporters continue to carry us harder than we carry Jake the Analyst on Helldivers.
It's not dying. You fucking idiot!
If you'd like to throw a few bucks our way, or just see your name in the end credits every month, then a link to do so will be down in the description. With all of that said, on behalf of the entire team, we'd like to wish everyone a very happy May.
That good old way, and who shall wear that starry crown? Good Lord, show me the way. Oh, Father, let's go on down. Come on down, don't you wanna go down? Oh, Father, won't you come on down, down in the valley to pray. Oh, brother, let's go on down. Come on, brother, don't you wanna go down? Oh, brothers, let's to